that was a really great overview, and I'm imagining a lot of people have a pretty good sense about the prison experiment at this point, which is, I think, a lot of people, anybody think it's not a failure? It's pretty failed. And Oregon is a really interesting example of draining resources at a time when we were featured on the BBC as an example of the failed American economy. Fairly recently, and Bend was the specific example. Oregon has been at the top. It is in the top 5 of
People in the back want to get in. Do you guys want to come up front?
There's space here.
Yeah. Sorry.
No problem.
I was going to ask you guys, if you get any questions for the audience, for the sake of the audio, can you repeat them?
Sure, yeah.
Just because this recorder probably won't pick up stuff.
Sure. So I'm going to be looking at Oregon's specific tethering to sentence reform, which has tethered Oregon in specific in a way that's also paralleled by what's going on in the country in general, to prisons as a drain on our resources across the board. And Oregon is specifically bad. We are the worst state, according to the Pew Center, for what we spend out of our general budget on prisons. The worst. We're worse than Alabama. We spend 10.9% of our general budget on prisons. Alabama spends 2.6%. We are far and away spending the most amount on prisons, more than Texas, more than California. It's pretty stunning to carry that type of an infamous spending role in this time when we have also one of the highest, top 5 worst economies, worst unemployment rates in the country. We've been at neck and neck with Michigan. Michigan now has #1 role, and we are at #5, but we've been moving around with a 12.3% unemployment rate. Now, these things dovetail because there's a spate of legislation that came down in the mid-90s in Oregon that's real specific. It's not like we have to accept this. And that's kind of the gist of my talk, is that this is fairly recent. This was a concerted effort by a very small group of people. In fact, one person, Kevin Mannix, who, anybody heard of Kevin Mannix in this room? Anybody not heard of him? Okay, so Kevin Mannix is a state, he's a representative, he's a Republican. He crafted this legislation in 1994 called Measure 11 that created mandatory minimums for violent offenders. Sounds good on paper, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what that really means. And concomitant with that legislation, really smart, also crafted Measure 17, which creates forced labor 40-hour work weeks for prisoners in this state. There's nothing like it in the country. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, the effect on rural economies where prisons are always cited to have all this labor drain into the prisons to prisoners who are being paid pennies on the dollar, who don't have to be paid minimum wage, and what that means for union and for labor and for contractors in those localities. It's a detriment to labor. So becoming one of the worst unemployment rates and having some of the highest rates of incarceration per capita and spending the most on incarceration have all come together to leave us with this really fragile place that we're in right now as a state. And I'm going to talk about Measure 57. Again, this was something that was, the legislators reacted to a piece of legislation proposed again by Kevin Mannix that it's mandatory minimums for nonviolent property offenders, repeat property offenders, and people who are addicted to primarily drug crimes. So that piece of legislation was effected last year. It's actually been put on hold because it's not sustainable. It is incomprehensible, in fact, the amount of people it's going to put in prisons. Besides the fact that it's just inhumane to put people who have major drug issues, that's not really the issue the legislature is going at with it. They're going at it with a real understanding that the rate of incarceration it's going to create will be unsustainable by the infrastructure as it is in Oregon. And then finally, I'm going to get to, if there's time, a little discussion on privatization, which has been big businesses' attempt to make money off of incarceration or privatizing prisons for profit, and what that trend means, and where it may go in Oregon in that direction, as we have a truly unsustainable incarceration rate at this point. So I think Caylor went over the stats. I think the Pew Center, the fact that we spend $1 in every $10 at this point is going to incarceration. We spend $1.06 for every dollar spent on education. That's more than healthcare, jobs combined, anything else that we put our minds to. Now, the legislation that really created this mess is really recent, and that's really good because anything can be undone, truly. Something that's pretty recent that is showing itself to be a failure, which Measure 11 and now Measure 57 really are, can be undone, but people don't know about it. So talking about Measure 11, which created these mandatory minimums, there were, in '85, there were 3 prisons in Oregon, now there's 14. And there are about 14,000 people who are incarcerated. Exponential growth rate just after Measure 11. Measure 11 puts in prison, including children who would otherwise be treated as juveniles, offenders of certain classes of violent crime. It's the kind of thing that whips up a lot of sympathy. It's the kind of thing where you can get a lot of poster stories by groups that are pro this type of legislation, and it worked. When this was voted into effect in 1994, it was overwhelmingly supported by the populace. But the effect is now we have these 14 prisons. And let's look at what these 14 prisons are doing. A lot of the pitch on these 14 prisons, which are always going to be in rural settings because the land is cheap, buildings are cheap, and a really effective way to pitch it is it'll be bringing jobs to your particular locality. And these are areas all throughout, wherever these prisons are sited here in Oregon, are all areas that are economically fairly devastated to begin with. One area is the county of Malheur. Malheur. And that's where the biggest prison went in just after Measure 11. They jumped up, they bid on getting the biggest prison. It's called Snake River, it holds 3,000 prisoners. And it was, at the time that this prison was built, one of the poorest counties. And now it is the poorest county in the state, now that it has the prison. It's got 21% people in its community living at or below the poverty line. It turns out that money from prisons do not go to the local economies. The same is true for Umatilla, which also bid immediately after Measure 11 was passed in '94 on a prison to be sited in their community. Again, a very poor community. They have actually lost jobs in the private sector since the prison has been sited there. Some of the reasons in terms of rural prison siting, which is pretty much where prisons are sited, why prisons actually in fact do not boost economies is because prisons don't pay local taxes. So that's pretty huge right there. There's absolutely nothing coming into the local tax coffers. They don't purchase goods or services locally. They tend to get them from private agencies. They tend to get them from other states. While they might hire locally, oftentimes they're not able to, they don't. People tend to come either from the unions who have seniority, if there is a union within the prison, which is often the case, and so there's going to be that. Or they're not from the region. They may move from out of the area for the job. For example, 62% of the employees in Ontario, they don't live in Oregon, they live next door in Idaho. That's where the property taxes and the house prices are lower. So money is not coming into the communities. This is true in every single rural prison siting experiment. And there have been studies, the Sentencing Project out of DC, Mark Maurer, they did a really important study in 2003 about how rural prison siting is a detriment to the communities they're housed in. And importantly, too, there are psychological deficits. There aren't a lot of studies on this, but anecdotally, the people who have studied rural prison communities have found that rates of domestic violence go through the roof when prisons are sited and people are working in prisons. When you are controlling people all day and belittling them and keeping them in line and telling them when to eat and telling them when to go to the bathroom and telling them when to go to sleep, you're going to come home, you aren't going to shut that off. You're going to come home and do the same thing in your family.